Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Looking forward to our next interview. I think this is the first broadcast to say I'm looking forward to welcoming the new Political Science Department Chair at the University of Virginia, Jefferson's University, Professor Jennifer Lawless. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Of course.
Congratulations on the new title, gig. I hope there's a pay raise involved with it. And certainly we have to change all your titles moving forward on all our broadcasts.
I expect nothing less.
Let's go to it. GDP numbers came out from the Commerce Department this morning, showed a negative 4.8% growth, the lowest GDP numbers since the last quarter of 2008 going into the Great Recession. And much more importantly, January and February were plus months. What's the impact politically of these GDP numbers?
The numbers are bad because they're also worse than what economists had expected, and I think what politicians were planning on talking about and around. So what this means is that the next two quarters become that much more important, and the expectations that the administration has placed on economic growth become that much more difficult to fulfill. So I think what we will likely see over the course of the next few weeks is tamping down on some of those expectations. We didn't see it yesterday. Jared Kushner came out yesterday and said that he thinks the economy is going to be rolling by June and we're going to be gangbusters this summer. But that's a lot of making up to do, and it's bad news for the administration. It's bad news for basically every incumbent, because people are judged based on whether the American people are doing better now than they were the last time they voted.
I think it's Goldman Sachs, don't hold me to it, has said that they think next quarter could be off 35%. There's a varying degrees from depending on which analysts you want to look at, but all of the numbers are just horrific. And they, as you say, were based on the second quarter maybe not being quite as bad as these numbers. Who takes the biggest hit, or is it equally dispersed to everyone, both in Congress and to the White House?
The White House takes the biggest hit. The president is always seen as the economist in chief. And so when the economy is doing well, the president gets the most credit. And when the economy is tanking, it's the president who takes most of the blame. This time around, we have a president who is actually very, very effective at distributing blame. So I wouldn't be surprised if Congress winds up taking a hit more so than they have in the past, just because of the messaging coming out of the White House.
It's also going to make cleaning up this mess a lot more expensive for the federal government. There looks to be very little life in the economy at any level of the structure. Obviously, healthcare is to some degree booming, but also being crippled by this crisis. There was bailout money in the 3.5 stimulus for hospitals, but that doesn't look to be close to enough. How many more stimuluses are we going to have, and what is going to be the total cost of these?
I mean, the cost is going to be some figure that I don't even think we can anticipate. And I think we're going to continue to see lots of these little packages because there's not much of an incentive for Congress and the administration to pass something huge if they genuinely believe that over the course of the next few months, we're going to see marked improvements. So it behooves them. It doesn't behoove the American people, but it behooves the politicians at this point to offer incremental stimulus packages because they ultimately might not need the 9th or the 10th or the 11th stimulus. As far as the healthcare system is concerned, not only is it taking a toll, but healthcare workers are being laid off and furloughed now in a lot of places across the country. And that's the worst thing that we can actually be dealing with. So the need for healthcare is greater than it's ever been before. But because a lot of these health companies, hospitals, and doctors' offices and practices are only doing essential and COVID-related processes and procedures, they're not making the money that they need to make to stay afloat. So it's just a terrible set of circumstances all coming together at a terrible time.
Let's stay on healthcare for 1 second, because I think there are some dynamics that are getting lost both in the national narrative as well as the local narratives. One factor is that primary care physicians usually work in small groups, maybe solo practitioners. Dr. Michael Fine, the former director of health for the state of Rhode Island, says, look for 30%, and he comes out of that space, look for 30% of Rhode Island's primary care offices to go out of business. That's devastating both for the existing healthcare superstructure, but even more so when we come out of it, and they are sort of the guardians from keeping people out of the emergency rooms. Will this crisis force a real national healthcare policy?
I think it has to, and not necessarily because it's just not good health care for people not to have access to primary care physicians, but more because of the economic ramifications of what we're seeing. And the system cannot sustain itself if people cannot pay. And people don't have jobs right now. Small businesses that were providing insurance coverage are not going to be in a position to do that because they're going to be out of business themselves. And more people are going to be relying on the government for healthcare. And so one upside for people that support Medicare for all or some sort of government system here is that basically we're going to wind up backdooring that in, because that's the only way many people, millions and millions of people, are going to be able to get any kind of health coverage or health care.
Let's go to small businesses and the payroll protection plan. The first round was $359 billion. It ran out in about 11 or 12 days. The second trunk of it was started on Monday. The SBA's website crashed for hours at a time. There's very deep concerns. We've had conversations with Senator Jack Reed's office that isn't close to enough money. Some estimates say it's another $1 trillion needed to just keep small businesses alive for 2 months. And then add to it the worst thing, big businesses going in and grabbing lots of creepy money, some of them returning it, but not many of them. The LA Lakers, Ruth Chris Steakhouse, et cetera. What does that say to Congress and Congress's inability to construct a fair and decent bailout plan?
It's incompetent and it's appalling. First, in terms of the incompetence, I would be a little bit more willing to give everybody a break if it had been done incredibly efficiently, right? If this bill had been completely rushed through, if it had been one phase, mistakes were going to be made. You could make the case that, well, the goal was to just deliver as much money to small businesses as possible, and not every error was caught along the way. We're so sorry. But that is not what has been going on. There's been negotiating behind the scenes. There has been more than one impasse. You have a president who comes out and thanks Shake Shack and thanks the LA Lakers and thanks Harvard and Stanford for returning the money. What is he thanking them for? They shouldn't have gotten it in the first place. And then when confronted with these kinds of incompetencies, he refers to the Obamacare website, which, most people don't even remember because it was more than a decade ago. So this is just one more example of trying to shift the blame, trying to not take responsibility, and doing it on the backs of small business owners who are the ones who are out there and really, really struggling. Frankly, it should not be up to Shake Shack to send that check back. Congress needs to do a better job.
It is an amazing scenario in which literally somebody gets caught red-handed stealing something. They say, oh, sorry, I'll give it back. There's no penalty, and there's actually some credit for not being a thief. Is that our new standard as a country?
It is. And I think people have come to expect Congress and the White House not to be able to produce the kind of meaningful legislation that people need and want. And so when something like this happens, the kind of, appalling, the attitudes that emerge are more like, well, this is just business as usual. What could we possibly expect?
Okay, we've touched on Congress, we've touched on healthcare, jobs. Are we done with Bleachgate? Are we past Bleachgate? Or is it just, I honestly, in a nonpartisan voice, I say it's the biggest error by a president since Jerry Ford said in the debate against Jimmy Carter that Poland was not behind as a part of the communist bloc. One of those things where you just wonder what possibly could the person be thinking.
But in fact, it's more dangerous because if you look at some of the data, various states reported an uptick in the number of 911 calls of people ingesting bleach and other household disinfectants. This is a president who, even if we give him the benefit of the doubt, as Dr. Birx has, and say that he was just musing at the microphone, I can't imagine that anybody actually believes that that's what was going on. But even if that's the case, you're the president of the United States. You don't have the flexibility to just muse at the microphone when people are listening to you and when they're scared and when they're sick. And I think that ultimately That's why these press conferences have been cut short. It's why few questions are being taken anymore. And it's why we're seeing a major change in the strategy. He cannot be sent out to just say and do whatever he wants, because it's clear now that there are going to be implications. I mean, the next day, the memes were all over the place, vote Joe Biden, he won't make you drink bleach. And frankly, he won't.
Okay, that's great. But I hear from Donald Trump all the time. I know he's president of the United States. It takes me a second to realize do we have an election this year, and who's the Democratic nominee? Because Stacey Abrams was on the candidate for vice president was on multiple talk shows this Sunday. Joe Biden was nowhere. I mean, do we have to go old school with milk carton campaigns to find Joe Biden?
It's unclear what the strategy is at this point. To his, we can give him the benefit of the doubt in that we know that he's in the process of trying to develop a campaign team that is able to think creatively about how to campaign in an environment where he can't really leave his house. The Sunday morning shows are obviously one option, and he should be the go-to Democrat. Of course, he does want to distance himself from Democrats in Congress right now who are not that effectively able to get through what they want to do. So he is between a rock and a hard place as far as that's concerned. He doesn't really have any authority at this point. So he can offer an alternative, but he can't actually implement that alternative until January. And I think that makes it tricky. The one other thing that I will say is, yesterday Donald Trump's press conference was at 3:30 instead of the usual time. That was the same time that Hillary Clinton was endorsing Joe Biden and trying to make news. And so the White House is clearly aware of the fact that it is going to be a tough contest, even if Joe Biden is basically in hiding. And the change in strategy yesterday, I think, is one example of trying to make sure that he's limited in terms of the positive coverage he gets.
But he's got to come out of the cave. I mean, at some point, there are some realities to running for president. Name recognition, which it may be high, but it's not as high as he thinks he is. He was vice president in political worlds a long, long time ago. Secondly, I don't think he's defined himself to the American people in any way, shape, or form. And you wonder if Donald Trump could just clean up the tweets and the embarrassing statements for a full month before the general, and whether or not Donald Trump beats Donald Trump. Because for other people, other than hardcore Democrats, middle of the road Americans, the majority of voters, they don't know who he is or what he stands for.
So that's right. Of course, we've seen over the course of the last month, Donald Trump be his own worst enemy. And Joe Biden's approval numbers have gone up consistently, and especially in battleground states where Trump has taken a hit. And so it could also be a strategy of the Biden campaign to let this go on for as long as they can, certainly until Biden is ready to announce a vice presidential candidate, so that Trump's numbers are as low as so that they bottom out, and that Biden sort of enters the campaign trail in a very, very positive way from a clear advantage. And so it could be that that's what's happening. I mean, if you see your opponent crumbling, and that's what Joe Biden sees when he sees Donald Trump go to the podium every day, there is something to be said about saying, you know what, I'm just going to let him do this to himself.
A lot of emphasis by the Democrats is placed on who's going to be the VP, that it's going to be a high-energy vice president. It's going to be somebody who reinvigorates the race. The reality is no one's ever voted for a vice president. Lloyd Bentsen was not vice president. We can go through all the great vice presidential candidates who then went on to other things because they didn't get elected. What's the dynamic here, and how does this change the game?
So this time, I think it matters for two reasons. First, we wound up with two old white guys at the head of the field when we had the most diverse array of candidates by gender, by race, by socioeconomic background, upbringing that we'd ever seen before. And so this is an opportunity for the Democrats to say, look, we might have an old white guy at the top of the ticket, but the party really does depend on this diverse coalition. And we're going to, whether it's symbolic or not, make it very, very clear. And we're going to set ourselves apart from the Republican Party in that way. So I do think symbolically it matters. The other reason it matters is because Joe Biden is not young. And so there are times where thinking clearly about a vice president matters more to voters, not necessarily where it's going to change their minds about who they're going to vote for, but it might make them a little bit more enthusiastic or comfortable with a candidate, knowing that if something happens to the president, this other person is going to step in. Now, I say that, and you can think back to 2008. Sarah Palin was certainly not going to be well prepared to step in if John McCain had won that election. So all of these, comments should be taken with a grain of salt. But I think those are the two reasons that this time it could be relevant. I don't think it's determinative.
On Abrams, though, she ran into a little buzzsaw on Meet the Press when asked about her leadership experience. She's never run anything. She sort of said, well, I've run some nonprofits since I lost the Georgia's governor's race. But that's not necessarily going to instill a tremendous amount of confidence. Does he have to be careful of that it's got to be a really, really rock solid choice? Or can he play with some variables with a greater degree of flexibility because of the dynamic time we're in?
No, he cannot choose Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams is amazing, and Stacey Abrams is not qualified to be president of the United States right now. Pete Buttigieg was amazing and was not qualified to be president of the United States. That's just the reality. There are a lot of women out there who are women in the Senate, women in Congress, women who have some sort of foreign policy experience, female governors who have executive experience. Stacey Abrams may very well get it. But at this point in time, given the dynamics that we have, and given that we've now had a president who has had no real political experience, no real foreign policy experience, and no experience in Washington, D.C., I think we see the upside to having both a president and a vice president who know how to navigate the, what's around them. That doesn't mean you need a veteran who's been there for 35 years, but it does mean that somebody like Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris or, Elizabeth Warren are much better suited. And I think that Stacey Abrams' political future is very, very bright. And I would not be surprised if one day she's vice president or president. But I don't think 2020 is her year.
Silly Andrew Yang, a Brown University grad, uttered a unbelievably crazy proposal when he was a candidate for president of the United States, which was that artificial intelligence, robotics, the changing workforce was going to, over the next few years, thrust tens of thousands, if not millions, of American workers out of their jobs, and that in order to have a social safety net standard, that every American should be paid $1,000 a month so that they could have some income coming in during this dynamic technology change. That seems rather rudimentary now, and now Speaker Pelosi has uttered some level of support that this is an interesting idea that Congress needs to think about. Your thoughts?
I think she's right. And I think the reason we need to think about this and the reason Congress needs to think about this is because 6 months ago, nobody could have ever anticipated that we would be in the situation that we are now, that unemployment would be what it is now. It wasn't because of artificial intelligence that we got here, but the numbers of people out of work, the kinds of jobs that are likely not coming back, aren't that different than the ultimate scenario that Andrew Yang mentioned. That scenario seemed a little bit strange, largely because of how he expected that we'd get there. But we're there. And so at this point, I think everything should be on the table as a possible solution. We have to figure out how people can afford prescription drugs, put food on the table, ultimately get their lives back together and take care of themselves and their families. And at this point, I don't think that we have the luxury of writing off anything that might have seemed silly or strange just a few months ago.
We still see that the White House leads and Congress responds. There's not a lot of big, loud noise coming out of Democrats in Congress. Is that going to change?
That'll change if the president becomes a Democrat. At this point, the Democrats can say all they want to say, but Mitch McConnell has made it very, very clear that he's the ultimate decider. Right? He and Donald Trump decide what's going to happen. Mitch McConnell runs the Capitol side of things, and Donald Trump runs Pennsylvania Avenue. So Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer can yell and scream all they want, but they're not going to get their way. And, I think that we have seen that across the board. There are certain times where there's some degree of compromise just because there's no choice. But this is not a situation where, sort of saying that we're going to be out there every day fighting is going to matter.
I hear angry fans there in New York starting to speak up. And so I'll give you the last word. What will we see in the next week in Washington, D.C., and what should we be looking for from a Q standpoint?
Well, so the first thing that that I think is going to get a lot of attention is the reopening. So most of these states are talking about May 8th and May 15th dates, which means that over the course of the next week leading up to that, the kinds of numbers that come out of Florida and Georgia and Texas and some of the states that have already begun to reopen, I think will play a very, very important role in determining whether the White House is going to stick with its guns or say, wait a minute, maybe we need to tamp down some of those expectations. The other thing is today, Dr. Fauci announced that he sees some promise in a vaccine and in a medication, that this is the first time that he's really sort of been somewhat optimistic. And so my bet is that we're going to see a lot of people jump on that bandwagon and do anything they possibly can to push toward a reopening of the economy. So I think that'll be the narrative coming out of the White House. Whether Congress cooperates is another question. The House is not coming back to Washington. And so, it's certainly not business as usual on Capitol Hill.
Chairwoman of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia, Jennifer Lawless, thank you so much for joining us. As always, great insight into what's going on into Washington, D.C. Thank you so much. Please stay safe. At 4 o'clock today, we'll have Health Matters with Brown University's Warren Alpert School of Medicine. Stay tuned for that. Thanks, everybody.